Hello and welcome back. This is the week 15 lecture. This is the final lecture of the semester, so we can rejoice, but I am going to break this up into two segments because, as you can imagine, we have a lot to cover today. So, step one is to finish Blake. We're going to talk about part two today, and I recognize that by the time many of you are watching this lecture, you might not be entirely finished with part two, and that's okay, just as long as you're finished before you take the final exam. So today, I'm not going to get into plot a whole lot. We'll talk about a few important moments and scenes, but mostly I just want to talk about some bigger ideas, some larger sort of rhetorical strategies that we can observe in part two. And we also have to acknowledge that part two is very different than part one. And we're not going to get a chance to really talk about both parts equally. I mean, our discussion post is about part two. I know a lot of you are just sort of talking about the book in general, which is fine. But we should notice that in part one, which we covered last week, we do see certain aspects that should remind us of traditional, conventional novels. Not all of part one might strike us that way, but I pointed out some specific scenes that are really quite well done, just from sort of a typical sort of aesthetic standpoint, especially if we're thinking about realism. So remember this distinction that I made, I think 2 weeks ago when we first started talking about Blake. I told you guys to make a distinction between rhetorical goals on one hand and what we might call mimetic goals on the other. So mimesis is just the realistic depiction of reality in a work of literature. And I think it's a fair, it's a fair accusation to level at Delany that he doesn't always achieve a high level of mimesis. And McGann talks about that in the intro. McGann claims that that's not necessarily Delany's number one goal. He has more of a rhetorical purpose in this text. He's making an argument. He's making an argument about black self-determination. He's making an argument about other things too, though. Emancipation, revolution. It's all part of this progression, this process that he thinks African Americans in the U.S., particularly enslaved African Americans, and when he's writing this, of course, the majority of African Americans in the U.S. are still slaves. Delany's not. He was born free because his mother was free. But remember, his father was a slave. So he's obviously intimately familiar with the institution. And what he's largely trying to do with this book is make an argument largely for black readers, trying to make the case that, hey, here's what we need to do, and here are some ways that we can actually do it. And I was, reading through the discussion posts, and I do feel the need to defend Delany a little bit here at the start of lecture. I normally don't get involved in the discussions. I like to, let you guys express your opinions freely. And I understand. Look, I get it. Blake is not an easy ride. It's hard. It's hard to read. It is a little bit clunky and awkward at times. I think in part because Delany is stitching together a lot of different things. Again, he's not strictly working within this kind of conventional novelistic frame that we might recognize. Again, in part one, he's doing that at times, but in part two, he's really not. I don't think we see as much in part two that would remind us of a traditional novel. He's really moving away from certain aspects of mimesis that he does achieve in part one. Again, I pointed out some scenes about the slave patrols, the frolic among the Negroes. Those are pretty realistic. I mean, those chapters are very detail-oriented, they're very granular, and he's very much striving for mimesis in those scenes. He's trying to capture the way life really was for slaves in the South during that time period. So there's a lot of that in part one. Now, I would argue, again, in part two, he's doing a lot less of that. He's a lot more rhetorical in part two. He's a lot more didactic. And we acknowledge this, and we don't really like didactic writers a lot of the time. They're not as fun. They're not as engaging. And I told you guys up front, Delaney is didactic. McGann points out in the intro that Delaney is didactic, so we can certainly acknowledge that. And, again, we don't have to like the book. But just reading through some of the discussions, I don't think all of us are engaging with the really important stuff here. And if you just don't care, you don't like it, that's obviously your choice and you're free to feel that way. But I would just encourage you guys to maybe dig a little deeper and think a little bit more about what's going on here. And let's try to get past some of the obvious difficulties that come along with this book. And again, you guys are making valid points about some of Delaney's limitations as a novelist. I think McGann also is prepared to kind of acknowledge those. That's no secret. And also, we can point out certain defects in his style, and we can acknowledge just the difficulty of reading the book because of its sort of stitched together nature, because he shifts in and out of different registers and different styles, frankly, and that can be jarring, and it's not always elegantly done. And we've acknowledged the difficulty with his use of dialect. So as we know, when we hear characters talk, when we hear a lot of these slave characters talk, Delaney is often using a dialect that many modern readers are going to find difficult to read and understand. And I get it. I've been there. I sympathize. It is difficult. It is hard to read, but I want us to try to get past that. Because on a certain level, the difficulty, the defamiliarization that we're experiencing as we read this book, that's kind of the point. Now, I don't think Delaney ever anticipated a big white readership because no African-American author of this time period would have expected that or would have had any reason to expect that. But just if we kind of imagine that he did sort of theoretically imagine the possibility of whites eventually reading this book, again, we have to keep in mind his number one goal isn't to accommodate the typical white reader. His goal isn't to make this palatable or to make this easy for us. And that's kind of our instinct just as readers. I'm not judging. I mean, I think that's natural. We want the things that we are reading or watching to make sense to us. We want things to kind of be translated into terms or language that we can understand. But we can definitely understand the dialect. I know it's difficult and it might require some, going back and rereading a few passages, but, sometimes they're dropping the ending of words. Sometimes they're not using the beginnings of words. We can notice certain patterns in pronunciation. We can overcome the difficulties. It doesn't mean that we have to like it. And I agree, there are moments when this book is not very aesthetically pleasing. But I think we need to remind ourselves that that was not Delaney's number one goal. And again, so for us, we can say, fine, it's not his goal. I still think the book sucks, but let's go beyond that and think more about the larger social function of the book. Let's think more about the rhetorical purposes that are certainly relevant here. And I think we need to get beyond our irritation at the dialect or our irritation at the way Delaney constructs his plot. And yeah, there are holes in the plot. Like I said in my discussion post, he's a sloppy, inconsistent writer, just like Charles Brockton Brown was. And we acknowledge that Brown had some of the same defects in his style. And like Delaney, Brown didn't revise his work. So there's holes in his plot, there's awkwardness and clunkiness in his writing style as well. And we acknowledge that when we were reading Edgar Huntley, but we didn't just dismiss Edgar Huntley out of hand because of Brown's defects. We acknowledged Brown's defects. We kind of made jokes about them, or at least I did, because I'm always game for that. We can laugh, we can say, man, this is tough going, this is really kind of tortured, purple prose. We can always say that, but we got to push beyond it. That's just an initial reaction. That's not analysis. That's not the end all be all. We can acknowledge it, but then we got to move on. And that's what we did with Edgar Huntley. We said, all right, yeah, the style's, a little clunky, but I think the consensus or the majority opinion was that, Brown's ideas were really good, but the execution was sometimes lacking. And I think the same is true here, right? We have to appreciate, I think, the revolutionary nature of this book. And again, that doesn't mean that you have to like it. I just want us to engage with it a little bit more, because there's more going on here than stylistic defects or a clunky plot. And again, we can actually account for a lot of Delaney's defects by reminding ourselves that he has more of a rhetorical purpose here. So I said last week, Henry's boring as a character. He's not three-dimensional. He's not super compelling. He's kind of a condescending ass to a lot of the other characters in the book. But again, Delaney's not really trying to make Henry into a great, complex, super realistic character. Henry has this symbolic function, right? Henry represents something greater that Delaney's trying to express. He's the kind of leader that Delaney wants for the kind of revolution that Delaney thinks needs to happen. Right? So there are things happening here that go beyond mimesis. They go beyond the typical functions of novels or even literature. So you might ask, well, then why are we dealing with it in a literature class? Because it still comes in the close of a novel. It still comes equipped much like a novel. And again, I would say in part one, it very much feels like we're reading a novel, at least at times. In part two, he departs from that. But he's using a very intricate structure. I think it's wrong to say that his plot just makes no sense at all, or that it's, just completely haphazard. Yeah, there's inconsistencies, and there might be a few things that don't quite add up or make sense to us, but let me speak about that as well. And again, another defense of Delaney, I'm not saying he's a great novelist, but I think a lot of us might be compelled to kind of poke holes in the plot because there's a lot of unfamiliar stuff going on here, especially as we move to Cuba and we see in part two, and we see a different system of slavery on display. So I've heard some of you, and you can be skeptical about the way Henry travels and some of the decisions that he makes concerning his wife and certain aspects of the insurrection that they're planning. But let me just kind of remind you guys that Delaney's not really making that stuff up out of whole cloth. A lot of what we see, particularly in part two, is based on historical fact. But what's interesting to me, it doesn't have to be interesting to you guys, but we need to acknowledge it. He's basing this stuff on historical facts that were not widely known to white people in the 19th century. And you might disagree, but I would argue that these are not facts that are widely known today for the majority of white people living in the U.S. That's what makes a lot of this strange. That's what makes a lot of this feel weird or wrong or just really difficult. And it is difficult at times, but part of that is just a necessary byproduct of an audience being exposed to stuff that we didn't know a whole lot about before. And I'm, again, speaking for myself. When I first read Blake in graduate school, I didn't know anything about slavery in Cuba and how it was different from the system that we had in the U.S. I didn't know anything really about slave patrols or frolics with the Negroes and what that really meant when men on a slave patrol said it. I didn't know any of that. And I'm from the South. I mean, you could argue that that's very much a history that my ancestors participated in. And I went to school in the South, and I didn't know. I knew very little really about slave life at all. We knew about slavery in a general way. But how often in K through 12 do we get a chance to really learn a lot about slave culture, slave dialect, the foods they ate, the things they did, the ways they communicated? Yeah, I know that it's kind of hard to believe that Henry would have such freedom of movement. And again, he's kind of the chosen one, so he can do things that regular characters would not be expected to do. But slaves really did communicate, and slaves really did find ways to meet in secret. Seclusions were a real thing. Like, that's not an invention of Delaney's. That's not an example of him not knowing how to construct a plot. Those were real. Slaves really did meet in secret. And as white readers, we know very little about that because it was all done in secret, right? It was done outside the white structures that ordered and organized life in society. So it's all new to us, just like the dialect. The dialect's weird for us, but that's not a defect of Delaney's style. That's actually an example of him being realistic. He is trying to realistically portray the way slaves spoke. And also, he does want to have a marked contrast between the typical slave characters and Henry, because Henry does not speak like that, right? Henry is enlightened. Henry has discovered the need for self-determination. That's all very didactic. We don't have to like it. We don't have to think it works artistically. But again, when we're thinking about the dialect, let's push beyond our irritation or the difficulties that we're having with dialect, and let's understand what Delaney's actually trying to do. And this is actually, his use of dialect, like I said, is one of those instances where he does have a mimetic goal. He is trying to accurately represent real life, life for slaves. Life in this particular slave-holding culture, at least in part one when we're in the South. So I kind of feel like Delaney can't win because we often get mad at him for not doing enough mimesis. And sure, in part two, he really moves away from it. And I agree, part two for me is more of a slog than part one. But then when Delaney does engage in mimesis and he is striving for realism, we often get mad at him for that too, because that's hard. And that's weird. And we're confronted with certain cultural signifiers that we don't necessarily recognize, and it's hard to sort of grasp it. And yeah, I get being frustrated with that, but we need to at least appreciate what Delaney is trying to do. And I also think we need to appreciate the revolutionary nature of what he's trying to do. Accurately depicting the life of a slave was not a common thing that any popular American author would have been doing in the 1850s. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote about slavery. She wrote about slave characters. But like we said when we were introducing Blake, she was doing that from the perspective of a white woman in Massachusetts who was an abolitionist and did sympathize with African Americans and wanted them to be free. But her perspective is limited because she didn't know very much about slave culture. How could she? That stuff was not in the public domain. That was not circulating. That was not part of the dominant discourse in the US during the middle of the 19th century. And I would argue that even today, we don't know that much about it. Because a lot of slave culture was necessarily kept apart and even secret from white people. And then also, and I'm sorry if you disagree, but I think a lot of people just don't want to think very much about the lives of slaves. We don't want to think or engage very much with, what they went through and the realities of that time and place. And again, I'm guilty. I think a lot of people are guilty of that. And it's hard to overcome that. And again, the book, it's not my favorite either if we're just talking about aesthetics. But I guess I just want us to go beyond aesthetics because Delaney is going beyond aesthetics. He's focused more on the rhetorical function and the social function that this book is supposed to serve. And again, remember, when he's writing, it's pretty revolutionary to capture some of the scenes that he's capturing, those slave patrols, some of those moments. Again, we might have seen somewhat similar material in the works of white authors, but it either would have been kind of whitewashed, kind of simplified. Again, Stowe was very much writing for a white audience. So she was going to put all of that in terms that white people were comfortable with and could understand. And furthermore, what Delaney is doing here is more revolutionary and more dangerous because he's a black author. And I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, David Walker and his 4 appeals, right? There had already been a pretty vibrant, robust body of work consisting of sort of abolitionist or revolutionary messages delivered in kind of essay form by various African American intellectuals, Walker being one who influenced Delany. But when Walker published his 4 appeals, there was a bounty placed on his head. He essentially became a fugitive because he was advocating for emancipation and revolution at a time when those things were not okay. It was not okay to talk about those things. It was not okay to support those things and to openly call for those things as a black man in the middle of the 19th century. It could be a death sentence for some. And I think we know that, but I think it needs to be a little bit more front and center when we're reading Blake. Just a little bit more of an appreciation that, even if Delany's not a super skilled novelist, he is innovative in certain ways. And he is kind of helping to create a genre where previously none had existed. So this is one thing I kind of mentioned in my discussion post. It doesn't matter if you read it, but just it helps our knowledge of the historical context here to remember that the first novel ever published by an African American in the U.S. predates Blake by just a few years. In 1853, William Wells Brown published a novel called Clotel, or The President's Daughter, a sort of fictional, very sentimental style rendering of, it was kind of a fictional version of Thomas Jefferson's life and his love affairs with slaves and the offspring of those affairs. It kind of, in part, based on history, but, just largely fictionalized. That comes out in 1853. Blake is the first installment of Blake is published in 1859. So like I say in my post, we need to keep in mind that in the 1850s, there isn't really African American literature in any kind of coherent way. There had been some black authors, Phyllis Wheatley, as we know, who had already been published. But when it comes to fiction, novels, that history was virtually non-existent when Delany starts to write. So to kind of capture the authentic African American experience, which is part of what he's doing, like we said, at least in part 1, there's not a lot of templates to draw on. There's not a lot of pre-existing examples. Delany's doing stuff that, quite frankly, other authors were just not doing during that time period, either because they didn't want to, or more likely, well, that's a big part of it, but also they just didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the experience to be able to offer the kind of detail and the kind of mimesis that we see with the slave patrols and certain other scenes, especially in part 1. And there are even moments in part 2 where he kind of returns to that move, to that style. But yes, he has these larger rhetorical goals that sometimes drown out his literary goals, and we can certainly observe that and notice that makes for a sometimes less than thrilling reading experience. But we do need to appreciate some of what Delany's doing because it is innovative. And we're going to see some more innovations and some more specific aspects of his structure, which is pretty interesting and intricate. We're going to see that stuff more in part 2. So one thing you should notice that at the beginning of part 2, we get a setup that's kind of similar to the beginning of part 1. So I mentioned, I hope I did last week, the hero's journey that we're obviously seeing here, a version of that. Something that was identified by an American anthropologist, but it's commonly found in ancient epics and all kinds of different literature. The hero has to go on a quest to save somebody or accomplish some goal. He has to fight bad guys. He has to overcome obstacles. And then at the end, he succeeds and whatever happens. So I would argue that we all know that basic narrative structure. It gets used all the time. And Delany's very much using it. And the first stage of the hero's journey is often called the world as it is. So at the beginning, before the journey actually starts, we see the hero in his sort of present day, everyday environment. before the big changes and the big adventures really begin. But here at the beginning of part 2, Henry's world is Cuba. So we've changed locations, and that means that there are important differences in terms of history. The social structure of this new place. And one thing that gets pointed out in the book, and again, it's not something that I knew anything about, and I don't expect many of us to know much about it. But one thing we see right away is that slavery in Cuba, while no less brutal and dehumanizing, does kind of function in a little bit of a different way. It's easier for slaves to acquire their freedom. They can kind of purchase it in a way that was not always accessible, though not impossible, but not as easy to do in the US. So again, that's a level of nuance and detail that it would have been lost on a lot of white readers then, and I think it might be kind of lost on us now. And again, that's not a criticism. That's just something we need to be aware of. Maybe we're not interested in it, or maybe we don't think Delaney explains it very well, but there's a larger significance to some of these differences. And it matters for the revolution, the insurrection that Henry is planning. So just to kind of go back to one of my earlier points, because I kind of got off track, I feel like we have a certain amount of skepticism about could Henry really be talking to all of these slaves? Could he really do that? And sure, like I said, he's a bit of an exceptional guy, so he's not always very realistic, but the seclusions, the planning, the communication networks, that's all real. That's real. Delaney's not making that stuff up. Slaves did find ways to communicate. They did find ways to travel. And again, we have to remember that we don't understand them because they were kept secret. I don't feel like I can stress that enough. The word says it all. These are seclusions. They are secluded. They are separate from the white power structure that would punish them, kill them, if they found out what they were doing. So there is this high level of secrecy and ambiguity that comes across in the book. But again, that's part of the point. They are shrouded in mystery. They have to be. That's the only way they can operate. Just like the dialect is hard for us to read, it has to be. Illiterate slaves in the 1850s would have spoken in a way that's difficult for us to understand. So at times, he really is striving for social realism, but even when he's not, there's always a reason behind his choices. The reasons might often be rhetorical, argumentative, and not very interesting to us as literature students, but there are reasons. So we find out that he's in Cuba to find his wife. He accomplishes that pretty quickly, and then he turns to sort of the next phase of his plan. And yes, I will not disagree with anybody who thinks that the events at the beginning of part 2 are very implausible, very hard to believe. But let's notice what Delaney's doing here, and he does it at times in part 1 as well. He's adopting kind of a sentimental style. Again, this isn't necessarily a defect in his style. But this is a moment where he's kind of using a pre-existing literary form that wasn't really made for the kinds of subject matter or, frankly, the kinds of characters, and in my opinion, the sentimental format wasn't really created for writers like Delaney in mind. I think we can all sort of recognize that. But just because of his time period, he was a reader. He read sentimental novels for fun, probably. He was certainly aware of them. They were a big part of the literary marketplace during his lifetime. So even if he didn't dig them, like Hawthorne, he knew of them, and he knew kind of how they worked. So he's using some of those strategies here. These are sentimental moves that he makes in the early parts of part 2. Not only discovering that this apparently older woman, this prematurely aged servant, is actually his wife. Again, we can scoff at that, but mistaken identity, tearful reunions, improbable events, those are all staples of sentimental fiction. So we can't really blame Delaney for that stuff. I mean, again, maybe he's using those conventions somewhat clunkily because they're not his sole focus. But these are all things that would have appeared in a lot of sentimental fiction. And again, this is maybe not terribly important, but there was a whole sort of subgenre of sentimental literature during this period known as tragic mulatto tales. Kind of an offensive term, but a mulatto at that time would have been considered somebody of mixed race. So this would often refer to light-skinned African American characters who could either pass as white or, they were just sort of placed in all of these difficult situations because they could kind of straddle the line between two different cultures, white and black, free and enslaved. And, Clotel, the first novel ever published by an African-American author, like I said, William Wells Brown, that's kind of a take on the tragic mulatto tale. Those haven't aged as well, frankly. I mean, Brown might actually be a better novelist just in terms of his artistic abilities, but he's using kind of an old trope that was really created by white authors. And again, I don't really blame him for that. I mean, he was trying to find his way into the marketplace. And how are you going to do that as a black author in the 1850s, before emancipation? You're probably going to need to use some familiar white styles to appeal to a broader readership. But let's notice that Delaney is not really doing that consistently, but he does do it at a few moments. He does appropriate some of these sentimental tropes, some of these sentimental moves, but he doesn't seem interested in doing that all the time. He just does that to kind of make his plot move forward and to explain some things. But yeah, it's very improbable. So later he meets Placido, this famous mixed-race poet of Cuba who was a real person. So here we arrive at something that's very strange about part two, and we have to acknowledge it. Delaney is combining fact and fiction. He's combining history and invention. Now, again, he wasn't the first to ever do that, and it's pretty common nowadays, but let's remember, he's working with a specifically African-American history. It's obviously a part of larger American history, but a lesser known part, a hidden part, a secret part, a part that for a long time, and again, maybe even today, a lot of people don't want to talk about. A lot of people don't want to deal with it. They don't want to engage with it. Makes us feel bad. We don't know what to do now about these atrocities in the past. So again, it's common to mix history and fiction, but Delaney's working with a history and a culture in certain, aspects of slave life that were just unknown or little known. So that's what makes some of what he's doing in part two quite innovative and quite different from the norm. You just wouldn't have found a lot of this, this kind of stuff in other literature from the period. So Placido's a very important character. Again, he's a real person from Cuba, but it turns out that he and Henry are like distant relatives. And again, that's a sentimental novel move. These improbable events, long lost family members being reunited. Yeah, it doesn't play that well now because people don't write like that now. But remember, books like The Lamplighter, other sentimental novels, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a sentimental novel. Those books were kind of at the top of the heap in terms of popularity in the middle of the 19th century. So Delaney's using a few of those techniques. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on in that same chapter where he meets Placido. I think it's the same chapter where they start to kind of hatch this plan to take control of a sailing vessel because according to Henry, a slaver, like specifically they want to take a slave ship as a sailing vessel that they can use because Henry says that they need that. We must have a vessel at our command before we make a strike. So again, never forget that they are plotting an insurrection. They are plotting a rebellion. And they are doing it now in Cuba. And it's a relatively complex plan that they are creating. And it can be hard to follow at times. because it doesn't unfold in quite the way that we expect. So if you look at, I believe this begins around page 201. So yeah, if you look during his time at sea, when Henry's at sea, beginning in chapter 44, there's about a 10 chapter section here that I just think is really interesting to consider. Between chapters 44 and 54, because the slave insurrection that they are plotting never actually happens. And again, if it's mimesis that we want, if we want less rhetoric and more novelistic qualities, as in more realism, well, that's pretty realistic. The vast majority of planned slave insurrections never got off the ground. They were never actually implemented for any number of different reasons, either because the white authorities found out, or maybe the organizers just lacked the resources to actually pull it off. Sometimes there would be an informant within the group, just like you see now, undercover agents like infiltrating these organizations and then reporting back to the white authorities so they can blow it all up and arrest and execute everybody. So again, Delaney's capturing something real about slave insurrections, but I think the reaction to a lot of readers, the reaction of a lot of readers is a letdown. It's like, nothing even happens. I was all geared up for something to happen on board the Vulture, and nothing even happens. They don't even do it. But yeah, that's more true to this time and this place and what these characters are actually experiencing. But it is ambiguous. It's weird. There's a lot of interesting stuff in these chapters about the slave trade, about the Middle Passage, which, like I said, is that general term that's used to refer to the journey that Africans were forced to undertake from, when they were taken as slaves from Africa over to the New World. And again, we noticed some of the things that we noticed in Benito Cereno, where the slave insurrection actually did work, at least briefly. It was eventually put down, but they did have some initial success. So once again, we notice that these slave ships are really weird spaces. Obviously, they're the sites of great atrocities and outrage and great violence and brutality, but they're also these kinds of weird liminal spaces, or like in-between spaces, because literally you're out in the ocean. And the blacks often outnumbered the whites. So if they were, like Babbo and company, if they were able to get organized and sort of overpower the white sailors and other slavers, they did have kind of an avenue, at least a short-lived avenue, towards perhaps finding freedom. But even if they don't, the white slavers, I may have mentioned this, they were often dependent on certain Africans who may have already learned English or may have had some kind of sort of high-ranking role within their own society. The white slavers often relied on, slaves like Babbo, who possessed the ability to speak English and were kind of respected amongst their peers. They relied on them to keep everything running somewhat smoothly. So there was this weird kind of power balance where the whites kind of relied on certain high-ranking members of these African groups. And sometimes that gave certain slaves a little bit of power and autonomy, not always enough to affect real change, but sometimes it could kind of play out that way. So these are really interesting spaces. And a lot of critics point out that there's something just inherently unstable about a slave ship. This is not a natural arrangement, right? Like we saw in Benito Cereno, we can easily flip it. The whites could just as easily be the slaves, and the Africans could just as easily be in charge. There's nothing inherent about these social positions. It's all arbitrary. It's all been determined by force and economic interests. But we can flip it, right? We can flip it. And it seems like that realization's always kind of an undercurrent on board a slave ship. Like the white slavers are always kind of aware, just like a lot of white plantation owners were aware, that if these slaves get organized and they find weapons and they decide to pull it off, we're in deep trouble. we're in big, big trouble. So again, this was a constant fear in the South. And it was the reason why punishments for any kind of slave organization, any kind of slave travel were so severe. But slaves still found a way around it. Delaney's not being fantastical with all of those details. There are some holes in his plot, but a lot of what we're seeing the slaves do, the way they communicate, the way they organized, like I said, a lot of that is based on fact. It's based on real slave insurrections in Cuba and in the U.S. Some of you might have watched the movie Amistad. Came out in the late 90s. It's about a slave insurrection that happens out at sea. And the ship was actually, I believe, a Spanish slaver. The makers of that movie probably read Benito Cereno in college. I think that ship was going to Cuba. But the slaves took over and they diverted it. They didn't want to go to Cuba for obvious reasons. And I think they had some conception of trying to land in a place where slavery was outlawed. I don't remember all the details, but they end up in Massachusetts, I believe, where slavery had already been outlawed. And that happened again in 1839, not long before this book. And we've mentioned several other real-life slave insurrections that took place throughout the history of American slavery. So it was always an undercurrent. So we should be reminded of Benito Cereno. But one thing I want us to notice is that in Benito Cereno, and I love Melville, I'm not speaking an ill word about Melville, but let's acknowledge that he's using the slave insurrection largely for kind of sensational, action-related purposes. It lends the tale its sense of mystery, suspense, that sense of menace, the danger, all of that. And then it kind of erupts at the end in this moment of action. So yeah, fine. I mean, that's what a white author would have probably done with this material, right? Presenting it as, sort of exciting, a motivating factor for the plot, but also largely using it for its fear factor, using it for its sensational aspects, because yeah, it's going to grab our attention, and it would definitely grab white readers' attention back then, and it would have scared the hell out of them. But again, remember, Delaney's not interested in that. Like, Delaney doesn't have the same goals. So for him, he doesn't care if he creates an exciting slave insurrection. We might care as readers, but we need to understand why he's making the choices that he's making. It's not because he just sucks at everything. It's because for him, a lot of these slave insurrections would never happen, right? They would be talked about and then thwarted. And again, notice that this seems like kind of an ill-conceived rebellion. Maybe it's not planned well enough. And Henry seems to wordlessly accept the change of plans and doesn't try to stir anything up. Instead, they take a different approach. They try to get all the slaves on board sold to light-skinned African Americans who could sort of pass as white. Which, again, that might seem bizarre, and that probably didn't really happen all that often in real life. But again, this is a way of Delaney showing that a lot of the excitement that slave insurrections would be used for in the hands of a white writer, that's just kind of, fiction. That's just entertainment. That's just something to drive the plot. He's after something different. At times, it's social realism. At other times, he's, again, as we know, making an argument. And here, the argument seems to be that not all plans are destined to succeed. Some plans are hasty. Some plans are ill-conceived. So there's this suggestion that maybe God's providence kind of stepped in and prevented this particular insurrection because it wasn't going to work. Most of them did not work for various reasons. So again, that's closer to reality. That's closer to truth, even though Delaney's not always focused on mimesis. That's actually a pretty realistic approach to a slave insurrection. And yeah, Melville's not totally off base. He's writing about a real slave insurrection, so he's also using history. But just remember the different goals for Delaney versus Melville or virtually any other white author. For Delaney, the importance of revolution and slave rebellion is not the entertainment that it brings or the fear that it puts in white readers' hearts, but rather it's part of a process, right? It's part of this self-determination process that every African American has to undergo in order to be prepared to seek and achieve freedom. That's not Melville's message, and that's not Melville's goal. So yeah, Delaney, there's defects and inconsistencies that we can point to, but let's keep his larger purposes in mind. So the final thing that I want to talk about, I'm actually going to stop my lecture here because I have to go and run. I have to run and do something else very quickly. But I'm going to come back for part 2, make my final point about Blake. Then we're going to talk about circumstance, and then I will talk very briefly about the final exam, and then you're finally finished with me. All right, so I'll see you back here for part 2.